Hey guys, chào các bạn. Tên tôi là Alicia và đây là Alicia Learns Vietnamese. And the topic of today's video is how to have a successful language exchange. There are now so many online communities that are set up to help facilitate people who speak Vietnamese and people who speak English to be able to meet and exchange languages so that both people can strengthen that target language. I was fortunate enough when I was living in Da Nang to do a lot of language exchange. I think I had, over the course of my time there, about 6 different conversation partners that I would meet with. And I learned through all those experiences some things that are really helpful and some strategies that honestly just were not useful and were not beneficial to anyone. So I wanted to share that information with you guys so that if you're thinking about starting a language exchange or having a conversation partner, that you can jump into that relationship and really make the most of that time for both you and your partner. So let's go ahead and jump into those tips. All right, my first tip is know your level and know the level of your partner. And I put up here the Common European Framework for language levels. I'm not saying you need to rush out and get yourself officially evaluated or know your partner's exact level, but just to have an idea of, am I basic, am I intermediate, am I advanced, and where's my partner in all of that, will be really, really helpful in terms of making the best use of your time. And you should also keep in mind that different skills might be at different levels. And I know this is a very general statement. Of course, it's not going to be the same for every Vietnamese student across the country. But I would say that generally the way that English has been taught in Vietnamese schools traditionally is very focused on grammar, vocabulary, reading, and writing. So oftentimes students haven't had a lot of practice with the listening and speaking skills. So you'll notice that maybe they're very advanced when it comes to grammar, but when it comes to actually speaking, they might be somewhere in that pre-intermediate or intermediate level. So those are things to just keep in mind. And later on in the video, I'll give you more specific examples of how to make the best use of that time based on your level. But let's get through the rest of the tips first. All right, my second tip is do not confuse your conversation partner for a language teacher. And this one is important for several reasons. One of them is there is a huge myth that the native speaker is always going to make a better teacher than another person who has learned that target language as a second language. And it really genuinely just isn't true. They might be superior when it comes to something like pronunciation. I think maybe at higher levels, it is beneficial to have a native speaker as a teacher who might be able to teach you colloquial expressions that someone who is new to the language might not know, or kind of cultural aspects of the language that maybe somebody who isn't at that level of the language wouldn't know. But when it comes to, especially for basic students, a native teacher is not necessarily better unless they've actually had practice and been trained in teaching that language. I remember the first year that I was teaching English in Chile, a friend of mine who was not in my class, who was also studying English, brought a question to me about auxiliary verbs and asked, why do some questions in English need an auxiliary verb and other questions don't? And honestly, I had no idea. I could look at the questions and tell you which ones needed them and which didn't, but I didn't know the rules surrounding why that was the case. And this is something that you're going to run into probably a lot with your conversation partner if that person is not sort of a language nerd or a trained language teacher. There are better ways to use that relationship than to coming to conversation practice and asking for a grammar lesson. And again, I'll get to those later on in the video. But just keep in mind that the person that you're working with isn't a trained teacher. You guys are exchanging your own language, and I'm sure you're going to learn a lot about your own language through this process as well if you've never done any language teaching or any kind of language exchange like this before. Another tendency that a conversation partner who doesn't have a lot of background in language teaching might fall into is trying to teach you way too much too fast. This is something that happened to me with one of my conversation partners. She would ask me a question which was full of vocabulary that I didn't know, Then she would teach me what each of those words meant. And when I understood the question, I still didn't have the language to respond to it. So she would teach me a response and teach me all the words in that, and then we would move on. So we had about 15 to 20 brand new vocabulary words, none of which I had actually learned or memorized, and we were now moving on to the next topic. So it was information overload, and I think this generally happens when you're new to a language. It's slower to acquire new vocabulary. Now, having studied and spoken Spanish, which is my second language, for about 15 years, I can learn a new vocabulary word very easily, but learning new vocabulary in Vietnamese is very slow going. And this is something that might be foreign to your conversation partner, especially if they've been studying English for a long time and haven't tried to take on a new language from zero in a while. Their understanding of your learning process might be a little bit different than the reality of the situation. So that's just something to keep in mind. Again, I'll give you ways to get around this and actually make the best use of that time together later on in the video. This is a simple one. Do not be afraid to correct your partner. Like I said before, you're not working with a professional language teacher. So really the best thing you have to offer your conversation partner is your trained native speaker ear, which can hear something is wrong with what you're saying. And if you stop them and drill that pronunciation, it will serve them so much. In Vietnamese, probably the most difficult thing to learn in general, but definitely if you're studying by yourself, is the pronunciation, specifically the tones. So if you can drill that with your partner, do not be shy. Do not be afraid to say, stop, no, that's not right, and just practice over and over and over the pronunciation. If you notice mistakes in their grammar, it's okay to stop them and tell them that's what you're there for. That is the purpose of this language exchange, so don't be afraid of it. Tip number 4, this is our final tip, is have clear goals and know your partner's goals also. This should be something that you talk about in your very first meeting. I did that with all 6 of my conversation partners, and I think every single one said, my goal is just to practice conversation. That is it. And that's pretty understandable when you consider what I said earlier about having that emphasis on the vocabulary, the grammar, reading and writing, and not getting a lot of opportunities just to use the language in natural conversations. That being said, I think there is more beyond that you can offer to your partner, and it can be a little bit limiting to just say, well, we're gonna get together and just talk about whatever. One of the limits of that is if you have a more advanced speaker, even at the intermediate level, really being able to have a basic conversation about what did you do last weekend, you know, how's work going, how is your significant other, friends, family, basic things like that, is not really going to challenge them in the same way that you could be doing in a conversation. So let's go ahead now that we've gotten through all the tips, transition into how to specifically use that time productively based on your level. Okay, let's start with a conversation language exchange between a basic Vietnamese language learner and a basic level English language learner. So this is admittedly the most challenging partnership. It is also, though, the most authentic. Usually if you're out there in the real world and you encounter someone with a different first language than you're probably going to speak the language that both of you have mastered to the highest level. So if your English is better than my Vietnamese, then we're going to be speaking English. In this case, if your English and my Vietnamese are at the same level, we're going to be pulling out every stop to just communicate basically in any way that we can. So you're going to see in a basic matchup, you're going to see a lot of probably drawing, maybe a little Google translating, a lot of miming out words, maybe using some realia, like the things around you, shirt, book. And it can be a productive exchange. Like I said, it's a little challenging. One thing I will say though is I have had language partners who were at a basic level of English. But their English was still better than my basic level of Vietnamese. So we still did lean more heavily on English to be able to communicate. You can still, though, do pronunciation. You can still have them correct things that you have written in your native language, or sorry, in your target language. This is something that I used to do a lot as well, because as I was studying on my own, I was learning more vocabulary and learning bits of grammar. And as I was learning grammar, I wanted to really put it into use and try to figure it out, kind of like a puzzle. So I'd write all these sentences that weren't necessarily like the most useful phrases in Vietnamese, but they were just kind of to check whether or not I understood the grammar I was learning. And then when I would go meet with my conversation partner, I would have her read the sentences and correct the mistakes. And you don't need to be an expert in the language to do that. She wasn't always able to explain to me why something was wrong, but usually between the two of us, we could kind of figure it out. Otherwise, I could go home and look it up afterwards. But it was just good to get that feedback. So in a basic to basic, you can use the time for that. That was good, doing the writing. You can always get corrected on your pronunciation. Even if the other person doesn't speak a high level of your language, they can show you how to hold your mouth when you make a certain sound, and you can emulate that. And another way is to practice a very structured conversation. I don't recommend for any basic student trying to have free-flowing conversation. It's just not realistic. Like I said, that's kind of the structure that one of my language partnerships took on early on, and it just wasn't productive. I wasn't really learning anything or growing. And then with one of my later partnerships with Jung, who's actually been in some of my other videos, she is also a language teacher, so I think that really helped, just her having a general understanding of where someone who's just learning Vietnamese and starting out is and what they need. She suggested doing kind of these canned conversations and dialogues where she would ask me really basic questions. Where am I from? How old am I? How am I doing? Things like that. And we would just kind of exchange back and forth like a call and response. And we'd practice this every time we got together for a conversation hour. And that was really helpful because it helped me internalize those structures, practice, and kind of memorize those things. But I definitely wouldn't go rogue and start asking your very basic level conversation partner something beyond what they should know. So in that time where you're working on the target language of a student who is basic, you can use any of those same strategies. And then when you switch over and you're working on a target language of someone who is more at an advanced or intermediate level, like I said, a lot of people, despite being at that level, just want pure conversation. I would suggest bringing in maybe, and maybe not initially, maybe in the beginning, because you're also just getting to know your partner, so it's okay, I think, to have a little small talk. But as that relationship goes on, that language exchange continues, it might be a good idea to bring in some topics that are a little bit more advanced, that require specific vocabulary or require you to express more complex thoughts, that you might need some more advanced grammar, advanced vocabulary to do that. And that'll just kind of push that advanced or intermediate speaker, to their next level and help them really grow in their language. You can find those questions really easily online. If you just Google conversation questions for and a topic with like ESL or something like that into Google, you should be able to find tons of resources. Another great resource that I will link here, and I've used this with Jung as well, is something called Conversation Questions by Grammar Points. And I love this resource. I used to use it as an English language teacher all the time because generally conversation's a lot more fun than a grammar lesson. So all you're really doing is talking with someone and answering questions, but each of those questions on the page use the same grammatical structure. So you're really practicing using that structure over and over and over again. And it's also going to be really clear really fast if the student does not understand that grammatical structure. And if you are not a language teacher or language enthusiast or linguist or anything, you can really easily give model examples of how you can answer that question without explicitly teaching that grammatical structure. And up at the top of that page, it's going to tell you the name of that grammar point, so you or your conversation partner can Google it later without needing to have a high level of understanding of language. All right, the last tip is you can use that time for peer editing of something that an advanced or intermediate student wrote. This might seem like it's still focusing again on your reading and writing skills, but actually you're going to be using language actively the whole time in that peer review process. So it's a good combination of looking at reading and writing skills, but also doing listening and speaking skills together. This is also good for someone whose partner is not a language expert, because it's easier to detect mistakes that are repeatedly happening in something that's written than it is in someone's speaking. So if you're looking at someone's essay and they've made the same mistake over and over and over again, you can easily note that and correct it. And 9 times out of 10, if they're doing that in their writing, probably doing it in their speaking as well. So that can be a really good way to identify common problems and fix them, again, without necessarily having an advanced understanding of language or grammar or knowing those names of grammatical points. Alright guys, I hope those tips were helpful. Go ahead and share this video with your conversation partner as well. Don't forget to give us a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you guys next week. También.